A widowed father bought a condemned luxury hotel for just $12,000, thinking he'd found a fixer-upper to help him and his teenage daughter start over after losing everything to grief and medical bills. But hidden behind the walls of the abandoned presidential suite was a treasure worth $275 million that powerful people had killed to protect. Before we explore this incredible true story, make sure to smash subscribe, because tomorrow we have an extra special story for you that will blow your mind. The morning fog rolled off Lake Vermilion like smoke from a dying fire, wrapping around the skeletal remains of the Grand Ashford Hotel. Michael Durant stepped out of his rusted pickup truck, his breath visible in the crisp October air, and stared up at the towering structure that had once been the crown jewel of northern Minnesota. The building rose 7 stories into the gray sky, its red brick facade stained with decades of neglect, windows boarded over like closed eyes, and ivy crawling up the walls like nature was trying to reclaim what man had abandoned. At 42, Michael looked older than his years. Grief had carved deep lines around his eyes, and the weight of recent loss sat heavy on his shoulders like an invisible burden that never lifted. His wife, Emma, had passed away 8 months ago, after a 2-year battle with cancer that had drained their savings and left him struggling to keep their family afloat. Every treatment, every specialist, every desperate hope had cost them more than money. It had cost them their future, their security, and eventually, the woman they both loved more than life itself. Their daughter, Sarah, now 16, had watched her mother fade away while her father worked 3 jobs trying to pay for treatments that ultimately couldn't save Emma. The medical bills had piled up like accusations, each one a reminder that love wasn't enough when cancer decided to take someone away. Sarah had her mother's wisdom and strength, but she was still his child, and Michael's job was to protect her from a world that seemed determined to take everything they had left. The auction notice in the local paper had been brief, almost dismissive. Grand Ashford Hotel, established 1895. Condemned property sold as is. Minimum bid $12,000. Michael had scraped together every penny he could find, liquidating Emma's life insurance policy and selling everything they owned that wasn't nailed down. He'd sold his tools, his truck, even Emma's wedding ring, though that decision had kept him awake for 3 nights straight. He wasn't sure what he planned to do with a massive, crumbling hotel. But something about the place called to him through the newspaper's grainy photograph. Maybe it was the way it sat proud, despite its decay, weathered but unbroken. Or maybe he just needed a project big enough to keep his hands busy and his mind off the empty spaces Emma had left behind. Every corner of their small rental house held memories that cut like broken glass, and he needed somewhere else to pour his grief, somewhere that wouldn't remind him constantly of what he'd lost. The real estate agent, a nervous woman named Patricia, who kept checking her watch like she had somewhere more important to be, met him at the front entrance. She fumbled with an oversized ring of keys, each one labeled with masking tape and faded ink that looked like it had been written decades ago. The keyring jangled in the cold air, a metallic symphony that echoed off the empty buildings surrounding the hotel. "Mr. Durant, I have to tell you, the city has been trying to demolish this place for years," Patricia said, her breath forming small clouds as she spoke. "The only reason it's still standing is because of some legal complications with the original ownership trust. You're buying a lawsuit waiting to happen, and probably a money pit that'll swallow every dollar you put into it." Michael nodded, his calloused hands deep in the pockets of his work jacket. He'd made his living as a carpenter and restoration specialist before Emma got sick, before everything fell apart. He could see past the decay to the bones of the structure, and the Grand Ashford had good bones, the kind of bones that lasted a century and would last another century if someone cared enough to tend them. How long has it been empty? Officially, since 1978, but there are records of maintenance and utility payments up until about 10 years ago. Someone was keeping the lights on and the pipes from freezing, but nobody knows who or why. The paper trail just ends. Patricia finally found the right key and turned it in the massive oak door. The lock clicked with the solid sound of quality hardware, and the door swung open with a groan that echoed through the empty lobby, like the building was exhaling after holding its breath for decades. The inside took Michael's breath away and broke his heart at the same time. Despite decades of abandonment, the Grand Ashford retained traces of its former glory, like an aging beauty queen who still remembered how to carry herself with dignity. The lobby soared 3 stories high, with a grand staircase that curved upward like a frozen waterfall, carved from marble and mahogany. Dust motes danced in shafts of sunlight that filtered through the boarded windows, creating columns of golden light that illuminated the destruction and decay. The marble floor beneath their feet was cracked in places, but still showed hints of its original elegance, inlaid with patterns that spoke of an era when craftsmanship mattered more than cost. Brass fixtures hung from the ceiling like sleeping giants, tarnished but intact, waiting for someone to polish them back to their original glory. Behind the reception desk, rows of wooden mailboxes still held their brass numbers, waiting for guests who would never come, messages that would never be delivered. The upper floors are in various states of decay, Patricia explained, her voice echoing in the vast space like she was speaking in a cathedral. Water damage, structural issues, asbestos concerns. The city inspector said it would cost more to renovate than it's worth, which is why the starting bid is so low. Honestly, Mr. Durant, most people would just tear it down and sell the land to developers. Michael walked to the center of the lobby and looked up at the coffered ceiling, its painted details faded but still visible in the afternoon light. Through gaps in the boarded windows, he could see Lake Vermilion shimmering in the distance, like a promise of better days. This place had once been where the wealthy and powerful came to escape the world, where presidents and movie stars had walked these same floors, where history had been made in private conversations over expensive whiskey. "I'd like to look around before I decide," he said, though he already knew what his decision would be. Something about this place spoke to the broken parts of him, the parts that understood what it meant to be abandoned but not destroyed, neglected but not forgotten. Patricia glanced at her watch again, clearly uncomfortable with the idea of spending more time in the decaying hotel than absolutely necessary. "I really should warn you about the top floor. The penthouse suite has been sealed off since the 70s. There was some kind of incident, and the authorities locked it down. The paperwork is so old and buried in bureaucratic red tape that nobody even remembers what happened, but it's been off-limits ever since." That caught Michael's attention like a fishhook finding flesh. In his years as a restoration specialist, he'd learned that the most interesting discoveries were usually found in the places people weren't supposed to look. What kind of incident? Nobody really knows. There are rumors, of course. Some say it was a suicide, others think it was connected to organized crime. The hotel was popular with certain political figures back in the day. And you know how those stories grow over time. She shrugged with the practiced indifference of someone who dealt with old buildings and older secrets on a regular basis. Probably nothing more than urban legend and small-town gossip. They spent the next hour walking through the first 3 floors, their footsteps echoing in empty hallways that had once bustled with activity. Most of the rooms were stripped bare, their contents long since sold or stolen, but the architectural details remained stunning. Hand-carved moldings spoke of an era when artisans took pride in their work, and hardwood floors beneath layers of dust showed the quality of materials that modern construction couldn't match. Every room had a fireplace with hand-laid stone or imported tile, and the windows, though boarded over, were tall and elegant, designed to frame views of the lake like living paintings. The 4th and 5th floors showed more damage from water and neglect. But Michael could see the potential hiding beneath the decay like gold beneath tarnish. This wasn't just a building, it was a piece of history, a monument to an era when America was coming into its own as a world power. The Grand Ashford had hosted presidents and kings, business titans and foreign dignitaries. Its walls had witnessed conversations that shaped the course of the 20th century. When they reached the 6th floor, Patricia stopped at a heavy door, marked with official-looking seals and yellow tape that had faded to a sickly beige color. The seals bore the emblem of various government agencies, but the dates were so old they were barely legible. "This is as far as we go. The 7th floor penthouse is completely sealed off by federal order." Michael stared at the door with growing curiosity. There was something about it that didn't sit right with his experienced eye. The seals looked old, but not decades old. The adhesive was still tacky in places, and the metal door itself showed signs of recent maintenance. The lock was newer than anything else he'd seen in the building, a modern electronic system that seemed out of place in a supposedly abandoned hotel. "Who has access to this floor?" "Nobody, as far as I know. The city has a master key, but they've never used it. The feds supposedly have jurisdiction, but they've never shown any interest in the place. Like I said, too much red tape and not enough people who care about old buildings." Patricia was already turning to leave, clearly eager to finish the tour and get back to her warm office. "So, what do you think? Are you ready to make an offer, or do you want to think it over?" Michael took one last look at the sealed door, memorizing every detail. Something was off about the whole situation, but he couldn't put his finger on what it was. The hotel had been officially abandoned for decades, yet someone had been maintaining it. The penthouse was supposedly sealed for security reasons, yet the seals looked recent. And there was something about the building's energy, a sense that it was waiting for something or someone. "I'll take it," he said, surprising himself with the certainty in his voice. The paperwork was completed within a week, a whirlwind of signatures and bank transfers that left Michael's head spinning. He used Emma's life insurance money to buy the hotel outright, leaving him with just enough left over to cover basic utilities and materials for immediate repairs. Sarah hadn't spoken to him much since he'd announced his intention to buy the hotel. But he could see the concern in her eyes every time she looked at him. She was worried he was making decisions based on grief rather than logic, and she wasn't entirely wrong. "Dad, are you sure about this?" she had asked him the night before the closing, her voice carrying the same note of gentle concern that Emma had used when she thought he was taking on too much. "It's a lot of money, and it's going to be a lot of work." Michael had sat beside her on their ratty couch, the same couch where Emma had spent her last months when she was too weak to climb the stairs to their bedroom. "Honey, I know it seems crazy, but I think we need a fresh start. Somewhere that isn't full of memories that hurt every time we turn around." Sarah had nodded, understanding beyond her years what he meant. Their small rental house was suffocating them with reminders of Emma's absence. Her coffee cup was still in the kitchen cabinet, her books still on the nightstand, her presence everywhere and nowhere at once. They needed space to breathe, space to grieve, space to figure out who they were without her. On the day he officially took possession, Michael arrived at the hotel alone. Sarah was at school, and he wanted his first real exploration of the property to be private. A conversation between himself and the building that would either become their salvation or their ruin. He parked his truck in the circular drive and sat for a moment, looking up at the building that was now his responsibility. The autumn sun cast long shadows across the facade, and for a moment he could almost see the hotel as it had been in its heyday. Flags flying from the corner turrets, luxury cars in the drive, guests in elegant clothing walking through the front doors with the confidence of people who expected the world to bend to their will. He'd brought a toolbox filled with basic repair supplies, a powerful flashlight for exploring dark corners, and a crowbar in case he needed to pry open doors that time had sealed shut. If there were secrets hidden in this place, and his instincts told him there were, he intended to find them. The first few hours were spent in the basement, checking the building's infrastructure with the methodical approach he'd learned from 20 years in construction and restoration. The furnace was massive and ancient, a cast-iron monster that looked like it belonged in a battleship, but surprisingly it showed signs of recent maintenance. Someone had been down here within the past few years, cleaning the system and replacing worn parts. The electrical system had been updated sometime in the 1980s, far more recently than the hotel's official abandonment date, and the plumbing, while old, was functional. Water still flowed when he turned the valves, and the pipes showed no signs of the freeze damage he would have expected in a building that had been empty through dozens of Minnesota winters. Someone had definitely been maintaining this place long after it was officially abandoned, which raised questions that made Michael increasingly uneasy. Who had access? Who was paying for the maintenance? And why keep a condemned hotel operational if no one was using it? It was while checking the water heater in a far corner of the basement that Michael made his first real discovery. Behind the massive boiler, partially hidden by decades of dust and cobwebs, was a small door built into the foundation wall. It wasn't on any of the building plans Patricia had given him, and it was secured with a lock that looked far newer than anything else in the basement. Michael examined the door carefully with his flashlight, his curiosity growing with each detail he noticed. It was solid steel, not wood like the rest of the building's doors, and the frame was reinforced with what looked like hardened steel plates. This wasn't original to the 1890s construction. This was something that had been added much later, probably in the 1950s or 60s, based on the style of the metalwork. The lock was sophisticated, military-grade from the look of it, with a complexity that suggested it protected something valuable. He tried his keys, but none of them fit. He tried his credit cards, bobby pins he'd found on the floor, even his pocket knife, but the lock was beyond his amateur lock-picking skills. He made a mental note to return with better tools and continued his exploration upstairs, but the mysterious door nagged at his mind like an itch he couldn't scratch. What could be worth protecting with that level of security in the basement of an abandoned hotel? The first 3 floors held no surprises beyond the expected damage from neglect, but Michael's trained eye began to notice inconsistencies that troubled him. Rooms that should have shown uniform decay instead showed signs of selective maintenance. Certain hallways had been recently cleaned, and some of the boarded windows had gaps that let in more light than others, as if someone had been moving through the building on a regular basis. When he reached the 4th floor, he noticed something that made his pulse quicken. The floor plan didn't match the blueprints Patricia had given him. According to the building plans, this floor should have had 24 rooms arranged in a standard hotel layout. But Michael could only find 22. 2 rooms were missing from the east wing, and the space they should have occupied seemed to have vanished into thin air. A closer examination revealed why. Someone had removed walls and reconfigured the space with surgical precision, creating a larger chamber that wasn't visible from the hallway. The work had been done so skillfully that it wasn't obvious unless you were looking for discrepancies, measuring distances, and comparing them to the official plans. Michael found the hidden entrance by accident when he leaned against what he thought was a solid wall and felt it shift slightly under his weight. The section of wall was actually a perfectly camouflaged door, held in place by magnetic locks that had long since lost their power. When he pushed hard enough, the door swung inward with a soft click, revealing a room that took his breath away and changed everything he thought he knew about the Grand Ashford Hotel. The hidden chamber was enormous, easily 40 feet by 60 feet, with a 20-foot cathedral ceiling that soared above hand-painted murals depicting scenes from American history. But what stunned Michael wasn't the size or the artistry, it was the condition. While the rest of the hotel showed decades of neglect, this room looked like it had been sealed in time, preserved with the kind of care usually reserved for national monuments. The hardwood floors gleamed with recent polish, reflecting the light from a massive crystal chandelier that hung from the painted ceiling like a constellation of stars. The walls were paneled in rich mahogany and painted a deep burgundy that spoke of wealth and power, and Persian rugs covered the floor in geometric patterns that must have cost more than most people made in a year. Antique furniture filled the space with the kind of pieces that belonged in museums: leather chairs worn smooth by generations of powerful hands, polished tables that reflected the chandelier light like mirrors, and bookshelves. lined with what appeared to be first-edition volumes, bound in leather and gold. The air itself seemed different, thicker somehow, as if it carried the weight of important conversations and momentous decisions. At the center of the room was a conference table made of dark mahogany that could easily seat 16 people. The table's surface was polished to a mirror finish, and scattered across it were artifacts that seemed frozen in time: crystal ashtrays with the residue of expensive cigars, cut glass tumblers that still held traces of aged whiskey, and a silver pen set that caught the light like precious metal. Michael walked slowly around the room, his footsteps muffled by the thick carpets, hardly daring to breathe. This wasn't just a hidden room, it was a hidden sanctuary, a place where powerful people had gathered away from public scrutiny to make decisions that shaped the world. The level of luxury and attention to detail spoke of money and influence that operated on a scale most people couldn't comprehend. On the far wall, almost hidden behind a tapestry depicting the signing of the Constitution, he found something that made his pulse race: a door marked "Private Elevator" in discreet brass lettering. The elevator was still functional, its brass fixtures polished to a mirror shine, the carpet inside thick and unmarked by wear. When Michael pressed the call button, he could hear machinery humming smoothly somewhere in the walls, a sound that spoke of recent maintenance and regular use. The elevator arrived with a soft chime that echoed in the hidden chamber like a bell tolling midnight. When the doors opened with hydraulic precision, Michael saw that the control panel had buttons for only 2 floors. This one, and the 7th-floor penthouse that Patricia had warned him, was sealed off and legally off-limits. Michael hesitated at the threshold, his hand hovering over the button that would take him to the forbidden floor. Patricia had specifically told him that the penthouse was under federal seal, that accessing it could bring legal consequences he couldn't afford. But everything about this hidden room and private elevator suggested that whoever had sealed the penthouse had wanted to keep people away from something far more significant than bureaucratic red tape. The discovery of the hidden conference room had changed the entire nature of his exploration. This wasn't just an abandoned hotel with historical significance. This was evidence of something that had operated in secret, something that connected powerful people in ways that weren't supposed to exist, and if there was one hidden room, there were almost certainly others. Michael stepped into the elevator and pressed the button for the 7th floor, his heart pounding with a mixture of excitement and fear. The ride was smooth and silent, and when the doors opened, he found himself looking at luxury that defied everything he'd been told about the hotel's condition and abandonment. The penthouse suite was absolutely spectacular, a testament to an era when wealth meant craftsmanship rather than mere expense. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered panoramic views of Lake Vermilion stretching to the horizon, and the space was furnished with antiques that belonged in the Smithsonian. Oil paintings in gilt frames hung on silk-covered walls, their subjects staring down with the confidence of people who had shaped history, and Persian rugs covered polished marble floors in patterns that seemed to shift and dance in the afternoon light. A grand piano sat in one corner, its ebony surface reflecting the crystal chandeliers that hung from a coffered ceiling painted with scenes from classical mythology. The instrument was perfectly tuned, as if someone had played it recently, and sheet music on the stand showed pieces by Mozart and Chopin arranged for private performance. But it was the master bedroom that truly took Michael's breath away and made him realize that he had stumbled onto something far more significant than a simple real estate purchase. The furniture was hand-carved from exotic woods and inlaid with mother-of-pearl designs that caught and reflected light like captured stars. The bed was a massive four-poster draped in silk curtains that probably cost more than most cars, and every surface showed the kind of care and attention that spoke of regular maintenance and use. On the nightstand beside the magnificent bed was a leather-bound guest book, its pages edged in gold, and its cover bearing the embossed seal of the Grand Ashford Hotel. When Michael opened it with trembling hands, he saw signatures that made his blood run cold and his understanding of American history shift on its axis. Presidents, senators, Supreme Court justices, foreign dignitaries, and names he recognized from history books filled page after page. But these weren't just famous signatures collected as souvenirs. Each entry was accompanied by dates of stay, and many of those dates corresponded to moments when these powerful figures were supposed to have been elsewhere, according to official records and public schedules. The guest book covered decades, from the 1930s through the 1970s, and every signature told a story of secret meetings and hidden agendas. This wasn't just a luxury hotel that had hosted the wealthy and powerful. It had been a clandestine meeting place, where the most important decisions in American history had been made away from public scrutiny and democratic oversight. As Michael flipped through the pages with growing amazement and horror, one entry caught his attention and held it like a vice grip. It was dated November 22, 1963, the day President Kennedy was assassinated. The signature belonged to someone Michael recognized from history books, someone who, according to official records, had been in Washington, D.C. that day, not in a luxury hotel in northern Minnesota. His hands were shaking as he closed the guest book and set it back on the nightstand. Whatever this place had been, it was far more significant than a simple luxury hotel or even a meeting place for the wealthy elite. This was evidence of a shadow government that had operated parallel to the official channels of American democracy, making decisions and forming policies away from congressional oversight and public accountability. And somehow, through a quirk of fate and a $12,000 bid at a county auction, Michael Durant now owned it all. The first phone call came at 3 a.m, shattering the silence of Michael's small rental house like glass breaking in a cathedral. He jolted awake from dreams filled with hidden rooms and leather-bound guest books, his heart already racing before his conscious mind understood why. For a moment, he lay still in the darkness, hoping it was a wrong number or some automated telemarketer who didn't understand time zones. But something cold and predatory settled in his stomach as he reached for the phone, and he knew before he answered that this call was connected to his discovery at the Grand Ashford Hotel. "Hello?" His voice was rough with sleep and growing apprehension. "Mr. Durant." The voice on the other end was calm, professional, with the kind of quiet authority that came from years of being obeyed without question or hesitation. It carried an accent that spoke of expensive education and old money. The kind of voice that issued commands from corporate boardrooms and government offices. "My name is Richard Cross. I represent certain parties who have developed a keen interest in the property you recently purchased." Michael sat up in bed, immediately alert, adrenaline flooding his system like ice water in his veins. The formal politeness of the caller's tone somehow made the intrusion even more menacing than if he had been openly threatening. "It's 3 a.m. What do you want?" "I want to have a conversation with you about what you may have found during your exploration of the Grand Ashford Hotel. I think it would be beneficial for all parties involved if we could meet tomorrow to discuss your options regarding this matter." The man's voice never wavered from its tone of polite reasonableness, as if waking a stranger in the middle of the night was perfectly normal business practice. "My options?" Michael's grip tightened on the phone until his knuckles went white. There was a pause, and when Richard Cross spoke again, his voice carried an undertone of steel wrapped in velvet. "Mr. Durant, you've stumbled onto something that's far bigger than you understand. There are national security implications here, issues that go back decades and involve people whose privacy and safety must be protected at all costs. The wisest course of action would be to walk away from this property and forget whatever you may have seen during your unauthorized exploration." Michael's mind raced, trying to process the implications of what he was hearing. Unauthorized exploration? He owned the building legally. How could exploring his own property be unauthorized? Unless these people believed they had some claim to the hotel that superseded his legal ownership. "And if I don't?" Another pause, longer this time, filled with the kind of silence that spoke volumes about power and consequence. When Cross spoke again, the polite veneer had slipped just enough to reveal the cold calculation beneath. "I would hate for anything to happen to your daughter. Sarah's a lovely girl, isn't she? Junior year at Northwoods High School, works part-time at the local coffee shop, dreams of becoming a veterinarian just like her mother wanted to be. She rides the number 7 bus home from school, usually sitting in the 4th seat on the left side. It would be terribly unfortunate if those dreams were interrupted by unforeseen circumstances. The line went dead with a click that echoed in Michael's ear like a gunshot. Michael sat in the darkness, his heart pounding so hard he could hear it in his ears like a war drum. They knew about Sarah. They had done their homework with the kind of thoroughness that spoke of professional surveillance and unlimited resources. They knew her schedule, her dreams, probably her route to school and the names of her friends. Whoever these people were, they weren't making empty threats or playing games. They had the capability, and apparently the willingness to hurt a 16-year-old girl to protect whatever secrets lay hidden in the Grand Ashford Hotel. He got up and checked the locks on all the doors and windows, then stood at the living room window, looking out at the empty street. A car he didn't recognize was parked under the streetlight at the corner, its occupants invisible behind tinted windows that reflected the amber glow like dead eyes. The vehicle was expensive, probably German, with the kind of understated luxury that whispered rather than shouted about money and power. Michael watched the car for an hour, but it never moved, and no one got out. It was simply there, a reminder that he was being watched, that his every move was being catalogued and reported to people who operated in shadows and made decisions that ordinary citizens were never supposed to know about. He didn't sleep for the rest of the night. When Sarah came downstairs for breakfast the next morning, she found her father sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee that had gone cold hours ago. Dark circles ringed his eyes like bruises, and his hands shook slightly as he tried to read the morning paper. She had seen him like this during the worst days of Emma's illness, when fear and exhaustion had worn him down to his bones. "Dad, you look terrible. Did you sleep at all?" Sarah's voice carried the same note of gentle concern that Emma had used when she worried about him taking on too much, trying to carry the weight of the world on shoulders that were already bowed with grief and responsibility. Michael forced a smile that felt like lifting weights with his face, just thinking about the hotel project. You know how it is when you're excited about something new and your mind won't shut off. Sarah wasn't fooled. She had inherited Emma's intuition when it came to reading people, especially her father. She could see the fear lurking behind his attempted casualness, could sense the tension radiating from him like heat from a furnace. "This is about whatever you found yesterday, isn't it? The thing you said might be dangerous?" Before Michael could formulate an answer that would reassure her without being an outright lie, his cell phone rang. The caller ID showed a number he didn't recognize, but something told him he needed to take the call. His instincts, honed by years of dealing with difficult clients and dangerous situations in construction work, were screaming that this was another piece of the puzzle that had started with his midnight caller. "Hello, Mr. Durant. This is Detective Martinez with the Minneapolis Police Department." The voice was professional, but carried an edge of suspicion that made Michael's stomach clench. "I received a call this morning from someone who said you might be in possession of stolen property related to the Grand Ashford Hotel. I'd like to schedule a time to talk with you about your recent purchase and anything you may have found on the premises." Michael's stomach dropped into his shoes. "Stolen property? That's impossible. I bought the hotel legally at a public auction with full documentation. Everything was above board. I'm sure there's a reasonable explanation, sir. But I need to follow up on all reported claims, regardless of how unlikely they seem. Would this afternoon work for you? I can drive up from Minneapolis, and we can clear this whole thing up quickly." After hanging up, Michael realized with growing dread that the pressure campaign had begun in earnest. The mysterious Mr. Cross and his associates were using every tool at their disposal to force him away from the hotel and its secrets before he could understand what he had found or decide what to do with it. A corruption investigation here, a building code violation there, maybe some trouble with Sarah's school records or his work permits. They would make his life miserable from every possible angle until he gave up and walked away like a sensible man who understood when he was outmatched. But Michael had been through worse battles than this. Watching Emma die by inches had taught him that some things were worth fighting for, no matter how hopeless the odds seemed or how powerful the opponents were. And something about the vault beneath the hotel felt like unfinished business, a mystery that Emma would have wanted him to solve, a truth that needed to see daylight regardless of who wanted it buried. He made a decision that would change everything, not just for himself and Sarah, but for everyone, whose lives had been shaped by the secrets hidden in the Grand Ashford Hotel. Instead of backing down and accepting the buyout that Richard Cross would undoubtedly offer, Michael decided to fight back. But he was smart enough to know that he couldn't fight alone against enemies with unlimited resources and decades of experience in making problems disappear. He needed help, and he needed it from someone who understood how powerful people operated when they thought no one was watching. Jack Sullivan had been Emma's uncle, though the family relationship was complicated by old feuds and political disagreements that went back generations. He was a former investigative journalist who had spent 3 decades exposing corruption in Washington before retiring to a small cabin in northern Wisconsin, after one too many death threats had convinced him that discretion was the better part of valor. If anyone could help Michael understand what he had found and figure out how to use it safely, it was Jack. The call went to voicemail. But Jack called back within an hour, his voice carrying the same sharp curiosity that had made him one of the most feared reporters in Washington during his prime years. "Michael, good to hear from you. How are you and Sarah holding up without Emma? I know this has been a hell of a year for both of you." "We're managing, Jack. But I need your help with something urgent. I found something that I think you'd find very interesting, but I can't talk about it over the phone. Too many people might be listening." There was a pause. Jack's journalist instincts were still sharp despite his retirement, and he could hear the tension and fear in Michael's voice. Years of dealing with whistleblowers and government sources had taught him to recognize when someone had stumbled onto something genuinely dangerous. "Where and when?" "Can you meet me at the hotel I bought? The Grand Ashford, on Lake Vermilion. But Jack, you need to know that there are people watching the place. This could be dangerous for you too." Jack chuckled grimly, a sound that carried decades of experience with powerful people who preferred to operate in shadows. "Michael, I've been chased by people a lot scarier than small-town politicians and their hired muscle. I'll be there this afternoon." While waiting for Jack to arrive, Michael made another call that he hoped would provide some protection for Sarah. Rebecca Torres was a former client whose kitchen he had renovated 2 years ago. But she was also a former FBI agent who had been forced out of the bureau after investigating corruption that reached too high up the chain of command. She now worked as a private security consultant, helping people who found themselves on the wrong side of powerful interests. "Rebecca, this is Michael Durant. I renovated your kitchen a couple years back. I need your help with a security situation that involves my daughter." "Michael, of course I remember you. You did beautiful work on that kitchen. What kind of security situation are we talking about?" Michael explained the situation as carefully as he could, without revealing too many details over the phone. Rebecca listened without interruption, asking only a few pointed questions that demonstrated her professional experience with these kinds of situations. "Michael, what you're describing sounds like a classic intimidation campaign by people with serious resources. If they're threatening Sarah, you need professional protection immediately. I can be there in 2 hours with a team." "I can't afford professional security, Rebecca. I spent everything I had buying the hotel. Don't worry about payment right now. If what you found is as significant as it sounds, there will be ways to handle the financial aspects later. Right now, we need to keep you and Sarah alive long enough to figure out what to do with whatever information you've uncovered." Jack Sullivan arrived at the Grand Ashford Hotel, driving a beat-up Ford pickup that looked like it had seen better decades. At 68, he still carried himself like the tough investigative reporter he had been. With sharp eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, and an expression that suggested he had seen everything the world had to offer and wasn't impressed by most of it. His graying hair was longer than fashionable, and he wore the kind of practical clothes that spoke of a man who valued substance over appearance. Michael met him at the front entrance, glancing nervously at the black sedan that had been parked across the street since morning, its occupants changing shifts every 4 hours with military precision. "Jack, I want you to know that getting involved in this might put you in danger. There are people who want this kept secret, and they're not playing by any rules, I understand." Jack smiled grimly, his weathered face creasing into lines carved by decades of confronting uncomfortable truths. "Son, I spent 30 years exposing secrets that powerful people wanted to keep buried. I've been shot at, sued, threatened, and blackmailed by some of the most dangerous people in America. If they haven't killed me yet, they probably never will. Now show me what's got everyone so worked up." Michael led Jack through the hotel, explaining his discoveries as they went, watching the old journalist's expression change from skepticism to amazement to grim understanding. When they reached the hidden conference room on the 4th floor, Jack let out a low whistle and began examining the space with the practiced eye of someone who had spent decades learning to read the signs of power and influence. "This is a classic intelligence setup," Jack said, running his fingers along the polished mahogany paneling. "Neutral ground for meetings that never officially happened. The kind of place where deals get made that reshape history, where policies are decided by people who were never elected to make those decisions." But it was when they reached the vault beneath, the penthouse, that Jack truly understood the magnitude of Michael's discovery. He walked slowly through the room, examining documents with the practiced eye of someone who had spent decades separating truth from fiction, learning to recognize authentic evidence from clever forgeries. When he opened one of the filing cabinets and saw what was inside, his face went pale beneath his tan. "Jesus Christ, Michael, do you have any idea what you found here? I know it's big. I know it involves powerful people. And I know that someone called me at 3 this morning threatening Sarah if I don't walk away and forget everything I've seen." Jack pulled out a thick folder and opened it carefully, his hands steady despite the magnitude of what he was seeing. Inside were photographs, financial records, and correspondence that detailed a conspiracy reaching the highest levels of government, business, and international politics. "This isn't just big, Michael. This is the kind of discovery that brings down presidencies and reshapes how we understand American history. We're looking at evidence of a shadow organization that has been manipulating American politics for over 50 years. What happens next will turn this night upside down, reveal a truth nobody expected, and remind us why sometimes the quietest voices carry the most power. Stay tuned to see what happens next. If you're enjoying the story, please like, share, and subscribe for more." Jack spent the next 3 hours photographing documents and taking notes, his journalist's training evident in the way he organized and cataloged evidence. What he found painted a picture of an organization that had operated from the Grand Ashford Hotel for decades, bringing together powerful figures from government, business, and international politics to make decisions that shaped policy and influenced elections from behind the scenes. "Look at this," Jack said, pointing to a document dated 1968. "This is a meeting, transcript from 3 days before the Democratic National Convention in Chicago. They're discussing how to ensure that certain candidates don't receive their party's nomination, how to manipulate the media coverage, and how to redirect public sentiment." Michael leaned over Jack's shoulder to read, his construction worker's hands contrasting sharply with the elegant script of the original document. The papers were signed by people whose names he recognized from history books, individuals who, according to official records, had been in different cities on the dates in question. How is this possible? How did they keep something this big secret for so long? Because they controlled the narrative, Jack explained, his voice carrying the weight of someone who had spent his career fighting against exactly this kind of manipulation. Think about it. If you own the newspapers, influence the television networks, and have people placed in key government positions, you can make inconvenient truths disappear. You can rewrite history as it happens, make sure that the official story is the only story that gets told. As the afternoon wore on, the scope of the conspiracy became clear, and with it, the danger that Michael and Sarah were facing. The organization had been involved in everything from the Kennedy assassination to Watergate, from foreign policy decisions that had led to wars to domestic economic manipulation that had enriched its members at the expense of ordinary Americans. They had operated with impunity for decades, believing their secrets were safe in the depths of the Grand Ashford Hotel. "The question now," Jack said as they prepared to leave the vault, carefully sealing it behind them, "is what you're going to do with this information. This is the kind of story that could change history, but it's also the kind that gets people killed without hesitation or remorse." Michael locked the vault door behind them, his mind racing with possibilities and consequences. "I keep thinking about Emma. She always said that when you know something is wrong, you have a responsibility to do something about it, even if it's dangerous. Even if it costs you everything." Emma was a wise woman, but she also loved you and Sarah. "Are you prepared for what fighting this battle might cost? Because make no mistake, Michael, if you decide to expose this, you'll be going to war with some of the most powerful people in the world." As they made their way back to the main hotel, Michael's phone rang with the special ringtone he had set for Sarah's number. Her voice was tight with fear when he answered, the kind of controlled panic that spoke of real danger rather than teenage drama. "Dad, there are men at the house. They said they're from the government, and they want to talk to you about the hotel. They're waiting in the living room, and they won't leave." "I'm scared, Dad." Michael's blood turned to ice water in his veins. "Sarah, I want you to go to your room and lock the door. Don't come out until I get home, no matter what they say." "Dad, what's going on? Who are these people?" "They look like the kind of men who hurt people for a living. Everything's going to be okay, honey, I promise." "I'll be there in 20 minutes. Jack overheard the conversation and shook his head grimly. "They're escalating faster than I expected. They must be more worried about this discovery than I thought. If they're moving this aggressively, it means they're either very scared or very desperate." When Michael arrived at his house, Rebecca Torres was already there with 2 members of her security team. She had positioned them strategically around the property and was coordinating their movements through earpieces with military precision. Her presence was both reassuring and terrifying, confirmation that the threat was real, but that he wasn't facing it alone. "The men inside aren't real federal agents," Rebecca told him as they prepared to enter the house. "We ran their license plates, and the car is registered to a shell company that doesn't officially exist. These are contractors, probably former military or intelligence, hired to intimidate you into compliance." Inside the house, 2 men in dark suits were waiting in the living room with the kind of aggressive patience that spoke of professional experience in making people uncomfortable. They had the look of federal agents, short haircuts, polished shoes, and the kind of confidence that came from having government authority behind them. But there were subtle signs that something was wrong. The cut of their suits was too expensive for government salaries, their shoes were Italian leather rather than standard issue, and they carried themselves with the loose readiness of men who were used to violence. The older of the 2 men stood when Michael entered, offering a smile that never reached his cold eyes. "Mr. Durant, I'm Agent Peterson, and this is Agent Williams. We're with the Department of Homeland Security. We understand you've been exploring the Grand Ashford Hotel, and we need to discuss some concerns about national security." Michael remained standing, his hands clenched at his sides, Rebecca's presence behind him, giving him the courage to resist the intimidation that radiated from the fake agents like heat from a furnace. "I bought that hotel legally. I have every right to explore my own property." "Actually, sir, that's where things get complicated." Agent Williams opened a briefcase and pulled out a thick folder that looked official but felt wrong in subtle ways that Michael's construction experience had taught him to recognize. "We've discovered that the Grand Ashford Hotel was never properly released from federal oversight. Technically, portions of that building are still under government control, which means you may have inadvertently trespassed on federal property. That's ridiculous. The auction was conducted by the city with full legal documentation. The city didn't have authority to sell what they didn't own, Peterson said smoothly, his voice carrying the kind of bureaucratic reasonableness that was often used to justify unreasonable actions. We're prepared to offer you a full refund of your purchase price, plus a substantial bonus for your inconvenience. All we ask is that you sign a non-disclosure agreement and turn over any materials you may have found during your unauthorized exploration. Michael looked from one fake agent to the other, his carpenter's eye for detail, noticing things that most people would miss. Their earpieces were too sophisticated for standard government issue. Their weapons bulged slightly under their jackets despite professional tailoring, and most tellingly, they kept glancing at Rebecca with the kind of recognition that suggested they knew exactly who she was and why she was there. "I'll need to see some identification," Michael said, knowing that real federal agents would have presented their credentials immediately rather than relying on intimidation and authority. Both men reached for their credentials, but as they did, Michael noticed something that made his heart stop. The older agent's jacket fell open slightly, revealing a shoulder holster with a gun that had a suppressor attached. Federal agents didn't carry suppressed weapons for routine inquiries or civil matters. These weren't government agents, they were killers. Michael backed toward the stairs, his mind racing as he realized that the situation had escalated beyond threats and intimidation to immediate physical danger. "Sarah?" he called out, his voice carrying a note of urgency that would tell her this wasn't a drill. "We're leaving, now!" The two fake agents immediately dropped their pretense of civility, their masks slipping to reveal the cold professionals beneath. Peterson reached for his weapon, while Williams moved to block the front door, but they had underestimated both Michael's desperation and Rebecca's competence. Rebecca's security team moved with military precision, coming through the back door and windows simultaneously, while Rebecca herself drew her weapon and trained it on Peterson. "Federal agents don't carry suppressed weapons to civil meetings," she said calmly. "Drop your weapons and get on the ground." The firefight that followed was brief but intense, lasting only seconds but feeling like hours. Williams tried to reach his gun, but Michael tackled him, his construction worker's strength and desperation giving him an advantage over the surprised contractor. They crashed through the coffee table, sending glass flying across the room, while Sarah's screams echoed from upstairs. Peterson was trying to draw his suppressed pistol when one of Rebecca's team members, a former Marine named Davis, put 2 rounds center mass that dropped the fake agent like a stone. The sound of gunfire in the small house was deafening, and the smell of cordite filled the air like incense at a violent mass. "Sarah, it's over," Michael called out as he zip-tied Williams' hands behind his back with restraints that Rebecca's team had provided. "You can come down now." His daughter appeared at the top of the stairs, her face pale but determined. She had inherited Emma's courage along with her wisdom, and while she was obviously shaken, she wasn't breaking apart. "Dad, are you hurt?" "I'm fine, honey. We're all fine." The sound of sirens was approaching in the distance. Rebecca had called local law enforcement as soon as the shooting started, but Michael knew that this was just the beginning. Whoever was behind this conspiracy had just escalated from threats to attempted murder, which meant they were done playing games and ready to do whatever it took to protect their secrets. "Jack," Michael said, turning to the old journalist who had taken cover behind the kitchen counter during the firefight. "We need to get that evidence out of the hotel before they figure out a way to destroy it." "Agreed, but first, we need to make sure you and Sarah are safe. These people have just shown they're willing to kill to protect their secrets, and sending contractors means they have resources we can't match in a straight fight." As the police sirens grew louder, Michael realized that his quiet life in northern Minnesota was over forever. He had become the guardian of one of the most dangerous secrets in American history, and there were people who would stop at nothing to make sure that secret died with him. But he also realized something else. Emma would have wanted him to fight for the truth, no matter what it cost. And if he was going to honor her memory and protect his daughter's future, he had no choice but to see this through to the end. The fake agents were taken into custody. But Michael knew that more would come. The people behind this conspiracy had too much to lose to give up easily, and they had just demonstrated that they were willing to kill to protect their interests. The battle for the truth, hidden in the Grand Ashford Hotel, had only just begun. And before it was over, Michael would have to choose between safety and justice, between hiding and fighting, between the quiet life he wanted and the dangerous path that had chosen him, but he wouldn't be fighting alone. Rebecca's team had proven their competence and loyalty. Jack brought decades of experience in exposing powerful conspiracies, and somewhere out there were other people who had been waiting for someone brave enough to challenge the shadow organization that had operated from the Grand Ashford Hotel for over 50 years. The community that would ultimately support Michael's fight was just beginning to form, but it would grow stronger as word spread that someone had finally found the courage to stand up to the people who believed themselves above the law. The quiet carpenter who had only wanted to give his daughter a fresh start was about to discover that ordinary people, when they stood together, could challenge even the most entrenched power structures. The war for truth had begun, and Michael Durant was no longer fighting it alone. The safe house in Colorado felt like a fortress carved into the mountain itself, all reinforced concrete and bulletproof glass that reflected the dawn sky like mirrors hiding secrets. For the first time in weeks, Michael could breathe without constantly checking over his shoulder. But the weight of what they had discovered pressed down on him like a physical burden that grew heavier with each passing hour. Rebecca Torres had chosen the location with the precision of someone who understood how powerful enemies operated. Remote enough to provide security from immediate threats, but close enough to major cities to maintain communication with the network of allies they would need to survive what came next. The ranch-style building was equipped with satellite communications, encrypted internet connections, and enough supplies to withstand a siege if necessary. Sarah had handled the upheaval with a strength that reminded Michael painfully of Emma, but he could see the strain wearing on her like water on stone. At 17 now, she was old enough to understand that their lives had changed forever, that they could never return to the quiet existence they had known in Minnesota. The girl who had once worried about geometry tests and college applications now helped Jack Sullivan organize evidence that could reshape American history. "Dad," she said one morning, as they sat on the safe house porch, watching the sunrise paint the Colorado mountains gold and crimson, "I've been thinking about Mom a lot lately. About what she would want us to do with all this." Michael felt his throat tighten with the familiar ache of grief that never quite healed, just learned to coexist with the rhythm of daily life. Emma's presence still filled the empty spaces in their conversations, her wisdom echoing in Sarah's voice and her courage reflected in his daughter's steady gaze. "What do you think she would say?" "I think she would tell us that truth is more important than safety," Sarah replied, her voice carrying the quiet certainty that came from deep reflection rather than teenage bravado. "She always said that when you know something is wrong, you have a responsibility to make it right, even when it's scary. Especially when it's scary." Michael pulled his daughter close, marveling at the wisdom she had gained through loss and hardship. Emma would indeed be proud of the young woman Sarah was becoming, strong without being hardened, compassionate without being naive. She would also remind us that courage isn't the absence of fear. It's doing what's right even when you're terrified. Inside the safe house, Jack Sullivan was working 18-hour days with the obsessive focus that had made him one of the most respected investigative journalists of his generation. The dining room table had become a command center covered with photographs, documents, computer printouts, and hand-drawn diagrams that mapped connections spanning 5 decades of American political history. "Look at this pattern," Jack said, showing Michael a timeline he had constructed from the Grand Ashford documents. Every major policy shift since the 1960s has been preceded by specific financial transactions between the same network of shell companies. They're not just influencing policy, they're positioning themselves to profit from decisions they help make. The evidence was overwhelming in its scope and detail, but Jack knew from experience that overwhelming evidence wasn't enough to guarantee justice. They needed a strategy that would make the story impossible to suppress or discredit, allies with the resources and credibility to amplify their message, and legal protection strong enough to survive the inevitable counterattack. Jack's first call was to Catherine Mills, his former editor at the Washington Post and one of the few journalists in America with both the integrity and the institutional support necessary to handle a story of this magnitude. When Jack explained what they had discovered, there was a long silence on the secure line that stretched like a held breath. "Jack, what you're describing sounds like the kind of conspiracy theory that destroys careers and newspapers," Catherine said finally, her voice carrying the weight of someone who had spent decades navigating the dangerous waters between truth and power. "Are you absolutely certain about this evidence? Because if we're wrong, we'll be sued into oblivion and laughed out of the business." "Catherine, I've spent 3 weeks analyzing thousands of documents, photographs, and digital records with the same forensic attention I used to bring down senators and cabinet secretaries," Jack replied, his voice steady with professional confidence. "This isn't theory, it's documentation, and it's current. This organization is still active, still operating, and they just tried to murder a widowed father and his teenage daughter to keep their secrets buried. All right, send me everything you have through our secure server. But Jack, you need to understand that if we publish this, we're going to war with some of the most powerful people in the country. They have resources we can't match and reach we can't imagine. Are you prepared for that fight?" "We're already in the fight, Catherine." They made that choice when they decided murder was an acceptable response to exposure. The question is whether we're going to hit back or let them bury the truth along with anyone brave enough to speak it. While Jack worked on building media support, Rebecca Torres was developing a legal strategy that would protect Michael and Sarah while creating multiple paths for the evidence to reach the public. Her contacts in law enforcement and intelligence had provided sobering assessments of their enemies' capabilities, but also encouraging news about potential allies within the system. "The good news," Rebecca explained during one of their strategy sessions, "is that some of these crimes are so old that the statute of limitations has expired. We can release information about historical activities without triggering immediate legal consequences. The bad news is that the current operations are ongoing, and exposing those could be considered interference with national security by prosecutors who may be compromised." Michael struggled with the ethical implications of what they were planning. The evidence showed that the shadow organization had been responsible for decisions that had cost American lives overseas, had undermined democratic institutions at home, and had enriched its members at the expense of public welfare. But it also revealed that some of their activities had been genuinely aimed at protecting national security, even if their methods were illegal and their oversight non-existent. "I keep wondering if we have the right to make this decision for the entire country," Michael admitted during one late-night discussion. "What if exposing this causes more harm than preventing it? What if there are ongoing operations that protect American lives?" Jack looked up from the laptop where he was encrypting files for transmission to Washington. "Michael, they tried to kill you and your daughter to keep this secret. They sent professional assassins to your home. That tells you everything you need to know about whether they believe they're acting in the public interest or protecting their own power." The decision was made for them when Rebecca's security contacts reported increased surveillance activity around the safe house. Advanced listening equipment had been detected on nearby peaks, and satellite imagery suggested that a coordinated assault was being planned. The shadow organization had found them again, and this time they weren't sending contractors with briefcases full of cash and polite threats. "We have to go public now," Rebecca announced during an emergency briefing. "If we wait any longer, we'll lose our chance to tell this story." they're moving military-grade assets into position, which means they've decided that eliminating witnesses is worth the risk of exposing their capabilities. That night, working with Catherine Mills and her team at the Washington Post, Jack prepared the first in what would become a series of articles that would expose the shadow organization's activities over the past 5 decades. The initial piece focused on historical crimes with clear documentation, establishing credibility before moving to more recent and sensitive operations. Michael provided first-hand testimony about his discovery of the vault and the attempts on his life, his carpenter's straightforward honesty lending credibility to claims that might otherwise seem fantastic. Sarah, against her father's protective instincts but with his reluctant support, agreed to be interviewed about how the conspiracy had torn their family from their quiet life and thrust them into a battle they never asked to fight. "I want people to understand that this isn't just about politics or history," Sarah told Catherine Mills during her recorded interview. "This is about real families being destroyed to protect powerful people's secrets. They were willing to kill my dad and me just for owning a building where they used to hold their meetings." The first article went live at 6 in the morning Eastern Time, strategically timed to dominate the news cycle before the shadow organization could coordinate a response. Within hours, it had been shared millions of times across social media platforms, trending on every major platform, despite apparent efforts to suppress its visibility through algorithmic manipulation. By noon, news networks around the world were picking up the story, with international outlets providing coverage that American media might be pressured to suppress. By evening, congressional leaders from both parties were calling for immediate investigations, and federal prosecutors were announcing that grand juries would be convened to examine the evidence. But the shadow organization didn't surrender quietly to exposure. The counterattack began within hours of publication, a coordinated campaign designed to discredit both the evidence and the people presenting it. Social media bots flooded platforms with claims that the documents were elaborate forgeries, that Jack Sullivan was a disgraced journalist with a history of fabricating sensational stories, and that Michael Durant was a grieving widower whose mental state had been compromised by loss and financial desperation. When character assassination failed to gain sufficient traction, they escalated to more direct methods that revealed both their desperation and their capabilities. The safe house came under assault just after midnight, a coordinated attack by professional soldiers using military equipment that should not have been available to civilian contractors. Rebecca's security team held off the assault long enough for Michael, Sarah, and Jack to escape through a pre-planned extraction route that led through mountain tunnels to a helicopter landing zone. But the message was unmistakably clear. The shadow organization was done operating within any legal or ethical constraints, and would use whatever force necessary to eliminate threats to their continued existence. "Where do we go now?" Sarah asked as their helicopter lifted off from the Colorado mountains, her voice steady despite the adrenaline and fear coursing through her system. Below them, the safe house was burning, and they could see armed figures moving through the compound, like ants swarming over a disturbed nest. Rebecca was already coordinating their next move through encrypted communications, her military training evident in her calm efficiency under extreme stress. "We go completely public, full exposure, maximum visibility. They can't eliminate us if the entire world is watching every move we make." The next morning, Michael Durant found himself standing before a bank of television cameras in the Washington offices of the Post, telling the world about his discovery in the Grand Ashford Hotel, while Sarah stood beside him with the poise of someone who had been aged beyond her years by extraordinary circumstances. "I bought a condemned hotel because my daughter and I needed a fresh start after losing my wife to cancer," Michael said, his carpenter's honesty cutting through the political spin that usually characterized such announcements. "I never intended to become a whistleblower or expose government conspiracies. I just wanted to fix up an old building and maybe find some peace for my family." Sarah's voice was equally steady, as she described how their lives had been shattered by powerful people who valued their secrets more than human life. They were willing to murder a 16-year-old girl to protect meetings that happened before I was born. That tells you everything you need to know about whether they were really acting in America's best interests. The interviews were broadcast live across multiple networks simultaneously, and within hours, Michael and Sarah had become the most recognizable father and daughter in America. Their story sparked nationwide protests, congressional hearings, and international diplomatic incidents as foreign governments demanded explanations for activities that had taken place on their soil. But perhaps more importantly, their courage sparked a flood of additional evidence from unexpected sources. Whistleblowers emerged from government agencies, corporations, and international organizations, all providing pieces of the puzzle that Michael had first discovered in the vault beneath the Grand Ashford Hotel. Former employees who had been silenced by non-disclosure agreements found new courage to pleaders speak. Government officials who had been carrying guilt for decades finally found a safe channel for their testimonies. The shadow organization that had operated in darkness for over 50 years suddenly found itself exposed to the harsh light of public scrutiny from every direction. Some of its members were arrested on charges ranging from conspiracy to treason. Others fled the country or retreated to offshore havens where American law enforcement couldn't reach them. Still others attempted to portray themselves as unwilling participants in activities they claimed to have opposed internally. For Michael, the victory was bittersweet and complicated by the enormous personal cost of their fight for truth. He and Sarah could never return to their quiet life in Minnesota, could never again walk through their small town without recognition and the knowledge that powerful enemies might still be planning revenge. The simple peace they had sought after Emma's death had been replaced by a blank, different kind of purpose, more meaningful but infinitely more dangerous. But as he watched his daughter speak to a reporter about the importance of truth in democratic society, her voice carrying Emma's wisdom and her own hard-earned courage, Michael realized that they had gained something invaluable in their battle. They had found their voices, their purpose, their place in a story that was larger than their personal grief and loss. The legal battles that followed were complex and prolonged, involving multiple jurisdictions, international treaties, and constitutional questions that reached the Supreme Court. Michael found himself testifying before congressional committees, grand juries, and international tribunals, his simple honesty providing a stark contrast to the evasions and technicalities employed by more sophisticated witnesses. "I'm just a carpenter who bought a hotel," he told one particularly aggressive defense attorney during a deposition. "I didn't ask to become part of this story, but when I found evidence of wrongdoing, I had a choice: stay quiet and safe, or speak up and accept the consequences. My wife taught me that decent people don't get to choose their moments of truth. They only get to choose how they respond to them." The Grand Ashford Hotel itself became a focal point of the legal proceedings, with federal authorities seizing the property as evidence while multiple parties claimed ownership or oversight. But public pressure and media attention eventually forced a resolution that transformed the building from a repository of secrets into a monument to transparency and accountability. The conversion process took 3 years and involved historians, architects, legal scholars, and technology experts working together to create something unprecedented: a fully transparent government facility where citizens could access historical records, observe ongoing oversight activities, and participate directly in democratic processes. Michael was offered the position of curator, a role that would allow him to oversee the transformation of the hotel while ensuring that its dark history was preserved as a warning for future generations. The irony wasn't lost on him that the building he had purchased as a refuge from grief had become a symbol of hope for democratic renewal. Sarah, now in college, studying political science and journalism, spent her summers working at the hotel as an intern and tour guide. Her favorite part of the job was explaining to visitors how ordinary people could challenge even the most entrenched power structures when they had the courage to speak truth to power. This place used to be where powerful people made decisions about other people's lives without any accountability. She would tell tour groups, standing in the same conference room where shadow government meetings had once shaped American policy. Now it's where citizens can come to understand how their government really works and hold their leaders accountable. The vault beneath the penthouse had been converted into an interactive exhibit where visitors could examine declassified documents, understand how historical conspiracies had operated, and learn to recognize the warning signs of corruption in their own communities. The guest book that had once held the signatures of conspirators now contained entries from citizens who pledged to remain vigilant against the concentration of unaccountable power. But the hotel's transformation was more than symbolic. It had become a functioning part of American democracy, hosting congressional hearings that were fully transparent to the public, providing secure facilities for whistleblowers to safely present evidence of wrongdoing, and serving as a training center for journalists and activists who needed to understand how power operated in shadows. Michael often walked through the building in the evening after the tours and meetings had ended, thinking about the journey that had brought him from a grief-stricken widower to the guardian of one of America's most important democratic institutions. The elegant rooms that had once hosted secret meetings now echoed with the voices of citizens demanding accountability from their leaders. One evening, as he stood in the penthouse suite watching the sunset paint Lake Vermilion in shades of gold and crimson, Sarah joined him with a letter that had arrived in that day's mail. "It's from Mom's doctor," she said, her voice carrying a note of surprise. "The oncologist who treated her during her final months." Michael opened the letter with trembling fingers, not sure what to expect after all this time. Inside was a brief note written in the careful handwriting of someone accustomed to delivering both good and terrible news. "Mr. Durant, I've been following your story in the news and wanted you to know that Emma spoke often about her hopes for you and Sarah after she was gone. She worried that grief might make you withdraw from the world, but she always believed that you had the strength to find a new purpose when the time was right. She would be extraordinarily proud of what you've accomplished and the courage you've shown in fighting for what's right." Michael felt tears running down his face as he finished reading. But they weren't entirely tears of sadness. Emma's presence had guided them through their darkest moments. Her values had given them the strength to fight when fighting seemed impossible, and her love had sustained them through transformations they never could have imagined. "She always knew we were stronger than we thought we were," Sarah said, putting her arm around her father's shoulders. "She just had to trust us to figure it out on our own." The memorial garden they created in Emma's honor became one of the hotel's most visited features, a quiet space where visitors could reflect on the cost of courage and the importance of standing up for truth even when the personal price was enormous. Her gravestone bore a simple inscription that captured everything she had believed about the relationship between individual courage and democratic society. "Truth is not the possession of the powerful, but the birthright of the free." 5 years after Michael's first exploration of the Grand Ashford Hotel, the transformation was complete. The building that had once housed America's most dangerous conspiracy had become a beacon of transparency and democratic participation. Congressional hearings held in its conference rooms were streamed live to the world. Government documents were digitized and made available to researchers and journalists. Citizens from across the country came to participate in workshops on civic engagement and accountability. The shadow organization that had operated from the hotel for decades was largely dismantled. Though Michael understood that new forms of concentrated power would always emerge to threaten democratic institutions, the price of freedom, as Emma had often reminded him, was eternal vigilance, and the Grand Ashford Hotel had become a training ground for citizens willing to pay that price. Michael's story had inspired similar transparency initiatives across the country, with other communities demanding access to government records and processes that had previously been hidden from public view. The movement that began with one man's discovery in a condemned hotel had grown into a national renewal of democratic engagement, "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you hadn't bought the hotel?" Sarah asked during one of their evening walks around the property. She was graduating from college the following month and had been accepted to law school, planning to specialize in government accountability and transparency law. Michael thought about the question as they walked past the memorial garden where Emma's memory lived on in blooming flowers and quiet reflection. "I think someone else would have eventually discovered the truth. Maybe it would have taken longer, maybe the cost would have been higher, but secrets that big don't stay buried forever in a democracy." "But it was you who found it," Sarah insisted. "It was you who had the courage to speak up, when speaking up meant putting everything at risk." Michael smiled, thinking about the carpenter who had walked into the Grand Ashford Hotel 5 years ago, broken by grief and looking for a simple project to occupy his hands and heart. That man could never have imagined becoming the curator of one of America's most important democratic institutions or raising a daughter who would dedicate her life to protecting the principles they had fought to preserve. "I think your mother would say that I just did what any decent person would do when faced with a choice between truth and comfort," he replied. "The real heroes are the people who come here every day to participate in the hard work of democracy, who refuse to let powerful people operate in shadows." As they completed their circuit of the hotel grounds, father and daughter walked in comfortable silence, both understanding that their fight for transparency and accountability would never truly end. There would always be new threats to democratic institutions, new conspiracies to uncover, new battles to fight between those who sought power without accountability and those who demanded truth from their leaders. But they also understood something else, something that Emma had tried to teach them through her example and her love, that ordinary people, when they stood together in defense of shared principles, possessed a power that no conspiracy could permanently defeat. The Grand Ashford Hotel stood as proof that even the most carefully guarded secrets could not survive the determined courage of citizens who refused to accept that some truths were too dangerous to speak. The last entry Michael made in the hotel's new guest book was a simple tribute to the woman whose love had given him the strength to fight for justice. "For Emma, who taught me that courage is love in action, and that truth is the foundation upon which all other freedoms rest." The Grand Ashford Hotel would continue to serve as a beacon of transparency and democratic engagement for generations to come. But its most important transformation had already been completed. It had changed from a place where power operated in darkness to a place where citizens could learn to shine light into every corner of their democracy. Michael Durant had bought a condemned hotel for $12,000 and discovered that it contained secrets worth $275 million. But the most valuable treasure he had found wasn't monetary or material. It was the knowledge that in a democracy, the most powerful force isn't money or influence or the ability to operate in shadows. It's the willingness of ordinary citizens to stand up and say, "This is wrong, and I will not let it continue." Anyone can change history if they're brave enough to speak truth to power and strong enough to accept the consequences of their courage. Sometimes, the most important battles for democracy are fought not by politicians or generals, but by ordinary people who refuse to let extraordinary circumstances reduce them to silence and fear. As the sun set over Lake Vermilion for another day, the Grand Ashford Hotel stood as a monument to the idea that in America, no secret is too powerful, no conspiracy too entrenched, and no citizen too ordinary to make a difference when democracy needs defending. The end. Up next, 2 more powerful true stories waiting for you. Click to keep discovering. And don't forget to hit subscribe if you believe the truth deserves a voice.